They said the Duke of Wexmoor would never love, only inherit, command, and produce. But they were wrong. I saw it the morning his carriage halted before the iron gates of Hawthorne Manor, when the mist clung low and the air seemed to hold its breath, as though the world itself knew that something long dormant was about to awaken. And if you've ever believed that love can defy expectation and outlast judgment, then stay until the end of this tale, and if your heart agrees, like and subscribe, for some stories remind us that dignity is its own kind of rebellion. It was England, 1862, an age gilded in propriety and polished hypocrisy. The Duke of Wexmoor, Henry Ashbourne, was a man as bound by his title as the ivy was by his stone walls, inseparable, suffocated, and magnificent all at once. At 37, he was what society called a perfect specimen of restraint, handsome in that austere, distant way that inspired both admiration and unease. He ruled his vast estate with precision, his life measured by duty and reputation. Yet for all his wealth, the abbey felt hollow. I remember walking its corridors, the endless portraits of ancestors, the ticking of clocks that seemed to count down something other than time. It was whispered among the gentry that the Duke's household was incomplete, not for lack of grandeur, but for lack of an heir. Parliament murmured. His mother wrote letters edged in desperation. London society waited, ready to present yet another line of simpering daughters whose greatest ambition was to become Her Grace. But the Duke, proud and impossibly weary, refused each with icy civility. He would not marry for convenience, he told his steward, though he admitted, perhaps even to himself, that he had grown tired of solitude's echo. And then came Miss Eleanor Vale. She arrived one grey morning when the roses still dripped with rain, a plain carriage pulling up to the servants' entrance. There was no entourage, no jewelry case, no flutter of parasols, just a single trunk and a letter of introduction from the Duchess Dowager. Her role, she was told, was to serve as governess and companion to the Duke's young niece, Lady Clara, a child unruly enough to have chased away 3 predecessors. "You'll find her difficult," warned the housekeeper. And His Grace, well, is not accustomed to being disagreed with. Eleanor Vale merely smiled. Then perhaps it is time someone disagreed with him. She was 35, though time had not softened her, rather, it had refined her. There was strength in her bearing, the sort that made even silence feel deliberate. Her dark hair was bound neatly beneath her bonnet, her gown modest, her gloves mended but clean. Yet her eyes, those grey-blue eyes, held a quiet intelligence that unnerved those unused to being seen. When the Duke first met her, it was in the great hall, beneath the watchful stares of his forebears. He mistook her for a clerk. "Miss Vale," he said, studying her as one might study a document for errors. "Yes, Your Grace," she replied without flinching. "I am told your niece requires instruction and order. I provide both." There was no tremor in her voice, no attempt to charm. It was an exchange so simple, and yet, as I watched from the shadows of the marble staircase, I sensed a shift, like the faintest stir of wind before a storm. Within days, the house began to change. Lady Clara, once untamable, now sat for lessons in the library. The child's laughter, bright and unrestrained, rang through corridors long accustomed to silence. And at breakfast, where His Grace once dined alone, second place began appearing across the table. "Miss Vale insists the young lady eat with her guardian," the butler murmured with something close to disbelief. It was there, between the clinking of china and the rustle of newspapers, that the Duke began to study her in earnest. Not as one might assess a servant, but as a man unused to curiosity. He found her conversation disarming, her wit dry, her insight inconveniently honest. She spoke not to impress, but to reveal truth. And she listened, truly listened, as though she could hear the man beneath the title. I recall one morning in particular. The Duke, brooding near the window, remarked upon the withering of the hothouse orchids. "They require constant attention," he said absently. "And yet they die." Eleanor, arranging the child's slate, replied, "Perhaps, Your Grace, they die because you give them too much of what they cannot live on." He turned to her then, brows furrowed, intrigued. "And what is that?" "Control," she said simply. "Affection forced into form becomes suffocation. Some roots must seek their own light." The words lingered. I saw the Duke's hand still, the faintest shadow of realization crossing his face. That night, for the first time in years, he left his study door open, and music, his late father's violin, echoed softly through the halls. They said the Duke of Wexmoor could not be moved. Yet from where I stood, I saw the first tremor, the beginning of something neither of them intended, but both had long been waiting for. And though neither would admit it then, the governess who came to teach order would soon teach him everything he thought he had no need to learn. By the time autumn settled over Wexmoor Abbey, the change within its walls had become impossible to ignore. The Duke, once a figure carved from propriety and silence, now walked the gardens at dusk, sometimes alone, sometimes in the quiet company of Miss Vale. Their footsteps fell in rhythm, their voices low, their silences companionable. To those who served them, it was as though life had returned to the house, fires seemed warmer, the air less oppressive. And yet, beneath this calm surface, something deeper began to stir, something neither of them dared name. It was not love at first sight, no, it was far more perilous than that. It was admiration turned curiosity, curiosity turned need. The Duke found himself seeking her counsel on matters beyond his niece's education, on the running of the estate, on art, on politics. Miss Vale's opinions, sharp but reasoned, both challenged and delighted him. "You mistake obedience for virtue," she told him once, when he dismissed a tenant's complaint too curtly. "Men of power often do." He might have rebuked anyone else for such boldness, but instead, he found himself listening. Her words unsettled him, not because they wounded his pride, but because they rang with truth. For Eleanor, the discovery was more subtle, more dangerous. She had lived long enough on society's margins to know what a whisper could destroy. And yet, she began to look forward to the quiet knock at her door announcing His Grace's request for conversation. The hours they spent in the library became a sanctuary, an unspoken truce between worlds that were never meant to meet. He read aloud from Milton, she countered with Browning, and in the spaces between their sentences, the air seemed charged with something fragile and unspeakable. It was on one such evening that I, ever the observer, saw the moment they first betrayed themselves. A storm had swept in from the coast, the wind howling against the windows. The Duke had insisted Miss Vale remain indoors rather than risk the carriage home to her cottage on the edge of the grounds. "You will stay," he said simply, not as command, but as concern. She hesitated, then nodded. The fire crackled low, casting gold upon her face as she sat across from him. "You do not trust the weather," she murmured. "Or yourself, perhaps." He looked up sharply, startled by the precision of her intuition. "I trust neither," he said at last, and something unguarded passed between them, a flicker, quick as lightning, but undeniable. The next morning, the household noticed the smallest of changes. The Duke lingered longer at breakfast. Miss Vale's laughter, once rare, now echoed faintly down the hall. Lady Clara, blissfully unaware of the undercurrents around her, began to draw portraits of Aunt Eleanor and Uncle Henry, though no such titles had yet been spoken aloud. The whispers began soon after. In the servants' quarters, in the parlors of neighboring estates, speculation took root like ivy, that the Duke had grown too fond of his governess. The ton would never approve. The daughter of a country curate, however clever, could not become Duchess of Wexmoor without scandal. Eleanor knew it too. I saw her avoidance begin, soft at first, then deliberate. She skipped evening walks, declined supper invitations, buried herself in the child's lessons. The Duke noticed. His temper, once restrained, flared at trifles. "She avoids me," he confessed to his steward one night, unaware I overheard. "And I cannot command what I wish to earn." But it was not avoidance born of indifference. It was fear, the kind only love can breed. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Vale wished to belong somewhere, to someone, and that longing terrified her. A governess could be respected, even admired, but not desired by a duke. That way led only to ruin. Yet when he came to her that final night of October, finding her alone in the schoolroom, she could no longer hide behind restraint. He stood in the doorway, rain glittering on his coat, his eyes dark with conflict. "You mean to leave?" he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she whispered, though her voice trembled. "It is best, for both of us." He took a step closer, the faintest trace of pain softening his precision. For both of us, he repeated. Or for the world that cannot comprehend us. She turned away, unable to meet his gaze. Your world has rules, Your Grace. Mine has consequences. For a long moment, there was only the sound of rain striking the glass. Then, softly, he said, perhaps I have lived too long obeying both. When he left, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. The next morning, her resignation letter lay on his desk, sealed but unread. And though no word passed between them for days, the Duke of Wexmo, who had spent a lifetime mastering composure, was, for the first time, a man undone. Winter came early to Wexmo Abbey that year, bringing with it a stillness that seemed to mirror the house's grief. Miss Vale was gone, her departure quiet, dignified, and absolute. The Duke did not stop her. He had watched her carriage vanish into the fog with the same expression he had worn at his father's funeral, controlled sorrow, the kind that hides behind duty. Yet the abbey felt emptier than ever. The laughter had fled, the child had grown solemn, and even the clock seemed hesitant to mark time. In the weeks that followed, rumors spread that His Grace would soon announce an engagement to Lady Cecilia Brentworth, a union suitable in every regard, except truth. But fate, that most mischievous of architects, is not so easily dismissed. The first 4 of spring brought with it an invitation to a charity gala in London. The Duke attended out of obligation, his composure immaculate, his heart elsewhere. And there, amidst the chandeliers and the murmurs of polite society, he saw her, Eleanor Vale, standing beside a publisher's table, her eyes lifted to meet his across the room. No finery, no diamonds, only the quiet poise that had undone him once before. The moment stretched between them, and the world seemed to fade. Later that night, beneath the lanterns of the courtyard, he found her alone. You returned, he said, as though the words themselves were a prayer. She smiled faintly. I was never far, Your Grace. Only giving you back your freedom. My freedom, he echoed, stepping closer. I mistook it for peace. It was neither. He paused, searching her face. They say a duke must marry to preserve a name, to secure an heir. But what is a legacy built on obedience? What is lineage without joy? His voice dropped to a whisper. You once told me some roots must seek their own light. I would rather have one honest bloom than 1,000 perfect branches grown from emptiness. She tried to speak, but emotion stole her words. He reached for her hand, not as a command, but a plea. Eleanor Vale, he said, I need not a wife of station, nor an heir of blood. I need a life that feels like living. Come back to Wexmo. Not as governess, but as duchess, if you can forgive a man who took too long to understand his own heart. The courtyard was silent save for the soft rustle of leaves. Then, slowly, she nodded. Yes, she whispered. But only if I may be your equal, not your salvation. His smile was unguarded, radiant. My equal, he said, and my queen. They wed quietly that summer, to the scandal of London and the delight of those who truly knew them. Wexmo Abbey bloomed again, not from wealth, but from warmth. Eleanor transformed its halls with kindness and art, its gardens with laughter and learning. And when the Duke was seen cradling the orphan child they later adopted, he was heard to say, I sought an heir, but found a home. I needed legacy, but found love. And so it was whispered in the years that followed that the Duke of Wexmo, once the loneliest man in England, had married beneath him, only to rise higher than he had ever been.